Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third lockdown webinar series of webinars that I'm doing from the NK stable of information. This one's about chronic inflammation resolution, and when I came across this information late last year, I was just, well, maybe not late, middle of last year, but I just knew that this was important because, you know, like going back maybe, I don't know, 10, 12 years ago when I started writing the pathology hologram series. Some of you might know this series of workshops that I wrote. You know, when I was writing about different pathologies, what really blew me away was the amount of pathology disease states that have chronic inflammation at their base is absolutely unbelievable. And chronic inflammation is one of the biggest problems we have in our modern world, in our body's physiology, because the way we eat, the way we live, and you'll see when we start talking about the triggers, and it doesn't even necessarily mean what we put in our body, it can be our psychological states, trigger inflammation. And if we sit in the chronic inflammation phase, we just sit in this phase where we actually have these inflammation cascades keep going, and this creates disease states, and we have absolutely no way to come out. And so when I started learning all this stuff about the resolution of inflammation, it was kind of like, oh, that's amazing. And I did last year some webinars, or not some webinars, I did some seminars. They were organised by Metagenics here in Australia, which is a nutraceutical company. And of course, when you do their stuff, it's, you know, that the information's targeted to their products, but that's okay. And I was really fascinated by this whole idea of the pro-resolving mediators, or the ability to produce hormones that resolve inflammation. And and then understanding about macrophages, which, you know, that we have macrophages which are totally involved with the inflammatory state, and there's different forms of macrophages. So some macrophages will release pro-inflammatory hormones and others will release resolving hormones. So we'll go through all that physiology. And a lot of you, I hope you've downloaded the PowerPoint, and you'll see right at the end I've added some NK formats. And I normally don't do that, but I think in this space, having those formats will really help the style of balancing I want to show you to do. But it certainly doesn't take away, like if you wanted to do the workshop I've put together, that's very different, because there we're going to actually go into the details of all the physiology pathways and the ability to produce the pro-resolving mediators, as we'll see. And you can see just this picture that I'm starting off with there. You've got the, you know, like you can see the green line. That's the way it should be. Unfortunately, we get the, let's call it maroon or something line, and where you get this chronic inflammation, and so you stay in that, and then we get all the symptoms of inflammation and pain and everything like this, and then we start taking drugs, you know, paracetamol, ibuprofen, and they relieve the symptoms of the pain, but also what happens is they inhibit the resolution of inflammation. So that's certainly not a thing to look at. No, I'm not screen sharing, thank you. But anyway, I'll start to share the screen. I'm looking at it in front of me. So now I am. I hope you can see that. And that's what I'm talking about, is the whole thing about inflammation. The green line is where we should be You know, inflammation should be acute. It's a defense mechanism, and it's there to help us. So some of the things we'll be looking at is the 3 stages of inflammation, the so-called M1 and M2 macrophages, but there's also another way of looking at which I'll present, because in the course of putting together this PowerPoint, I found all this other stuff about tissue-residing macrophages and monocyte-derived macrophages. So that was kind of an interesting thing to look at, and the whole thing with the M1 and M2 macrophages, for those of you who know about them, is most of the studies were actually done in vitro and not in vivo. So but it doesn't change anything. If we want to think of different types of macrophages, one thing is for sure: one phase macrophages produce pro-inflammatory cytokines that activate inflammation. It should be there as an acute response. And then there's another phase where they produce the anti-inflammatory cytokines and the so-called pro-resolving mediators, which are the omega-3, mainly fatty acid-derived hormones called resolvins. So we'll be looking at that. We'll be looking at the specialized pro-resolving mediators, which are the ones derived from fatty acids, fatty acid precursors. And so I'll just talk a little bit about fatty acid biochemistry. I know a lot of you probably understand it really well, but I like to just go through it to make sure people understand the importance. What does omega-3 and omega-6 mean? What's the difference between cis and trans, saturated, unsaturated? And because this is all critical in the pathways for the production of these pro-resolving mediators. And it's something, you know, when you actually look in it and you read, or, you know, say go to PubMed or something like this and start reading about it, that, you know, that one of the problems with the understanding of the pro-resolving mediators, the omega-3, especially fatty acid-derived resolving hormones, is they have a very short half-life, which means they degrade very quickly, so they're hard to measure. You know, technically they're hard to measure. So we'll look a little bit about the acupressure formatting. As I said, I'll introduce that, and then I'll talk about, you know, basically I'll go through some balancing ideas and showing you how you can use what I'm presenting here to show you what I'm using what I'm presenting here, so you can use it in your clinic. You know, even like, I understand that not everyone's going to rush out and do my workshops. I'm certainly not doing it for this. But what I want is with this, because the idea of this is to be professional development, that you should be able to take away something from what I present today that you can use with your clients. So anyway, let's talk a little bit about inflammation. Take 2, there it goes. Okay, so inflammation has basically kind of 3 phases, and you've got the trigger, the pro-inflammatory response, and then the resolving response, where you get the tissue repair and regeneration. And this is really, really important, because when you're in chronic inflammation, this you don't get. So once you have a trigger, and we'll talk about triggers in a minute, and if you've looked at the slides, you can see it's on the next one. The first thing you get in the pro-inflammatory phase is edema, which is a fancy way of saying you get swelling, you know. So if you've got swelling in your ankle because you've got an injury or an infection, so what that does is it brings fluid in, it opens the capillaries so the immune cells can get in and do their thing. Then you get the neutrophils. The PMN basically means neutrophils, and then they bring in the macrophages and monocytes, which is kind of interesting, because the monocytes are derived from your bone marrow and they float around the blood. When you've got the tissue residing macrophages, and this is something that totally blew my mind. I had to read it 3 times to be sure that that was actually what they meant. The tissue residing macrophages were formed in your embryonic life when you were a yolk sac and in the fetal liver. And then they go into the tissues and they self-perpetuate. They keep proliferating over time. So they self-perpetuate. And that just kind of like, I'm like going, what? Do you mean they were formed, you know, because it's interesting when you look at even the hemoglobin is, you know, not always produced, you know, like the heme, we know is produced in the bone marrow, but in the fetal life, it's not produced in the bone marrow. It's produced in the liver and stuff like this, and so in the yolk sac. And so that the yolk sac and fetal liver in the embryonic life have the role of the bone marrow as it comes on later on. And so that the macrophages produced at this time go and sit in your tissues, and they just sit there, keep proliferating, waiting to be called upon to do action. And that's, you know, sometimes I look at the human body and it just blows my mind how amazing it is. These things that it does, I just like, oh my God, how does it, you know, who could think of this thing? I mean, who could design it? I mean, if we were designed by God, he's one hell of an engineer. That's all I can say. And I can say that because I studied engineering at university. But anyway. So let's look at the, you know, as I was saying, we've got the 3 phases. The first is the triggers. So the triggers is what causes it. So if you look at microbial attack and injury, that's really jungle life, you know. So that was like, we exist in the jungle. You're either going to have some bloody microbe attack you or you get injured. So this is what it was actually designed for, you know, when we were like running around in the jungle in our loincloths, hunting, whatever. And so the rest shouldn't be there. They're like constructs of the way we live, you know, like radiation. And I know that this is a hot topic with the 5G and everything like this, and the EMF stress and ionizing radiation and what that is, and, you know, it is a really hot topic. I try to avoid talking to people about it because people have so many different ideas about it. All I know is I can tell you how I understand to balance it. And I'm not going to make any judgments about anything else. Psychological stress, and this is a big one. And there's something called the perceived stress, and there's the perceived stress scale. I don't know if anyone's ever heard of that. It's probably more part of the psychological model of looking at things. And what they've found, and certainly what I've seen in, you know, because I wrote the course on the burnout and everything like this, it's the perceived stress is the most important thing. Because you're going to have an event, right? And for one person, it's not stressful. And the next person, same event, and they're totally stressed out about it for years, days, whatever. So perceived stress is really the most important one. And, you know, when you look at this, psychological stress can cause inflammation. And the thing is us humans, and I've certainly noticed this from what we do when we just the way we live, is that we have all these psychological stresses in our life. Like, you know, when we lived in the jungle, it was simple, you know. Have we got a nice place to stay? Can we be warm tonight? Have we got enough food? Or then it's like, have I got someone to mate with or something like this? Now it's like, oh my God, we've got this, we've got that. And the amount of stresses in the world at the moment with the coronavirus, I mean, you know, and then just talking to different people and they have different ideas about it. But the thing is, it's what you perceive as stressful. And when I talk to my family members from Guayaquil in Ecuador, I mean, they've got so much stress, like unbelievable. Like here where I live in Murwillumbah, there's not even one case. We're just like, go to the farmer's market, yeah. Okay, don't come too close. You know, we're supposed to be socially distancing. Okay, you know, go to the shop. Okay, buy some food. Everyone's just pretty chilled out. But other people, I remember the first time I went to the farmer's market, I just come back. I was just allowed to go out because I've been self-isolated, and I was just totally stressed out by, you know, someone wanting to come near me to get a bag off the thing, and I just totally lost the plot. I was just like, no, you can't. I'm on my ex. You don't come near me. Do you know what I mean? And I had this whole debacle at the market. This woman wanted a bag, and I was standing on the X in front of the bags, and I just didn't want her to come near me. But of course, in the past, that wouldn't matter. But the thing is psychological stress creates inflammation. And if we have, and our lifestyle, the way we live today is totally we have this chronic psychological stress in our life. You know, even from, you know, as a child, when you watch, you know, the media and you say, I should look like that. And when maybe someone gets an eating disorder or this or that, you know, there's so many stresses in our life, and they place psychological stress. The psychology of stress is so huge at the moment. And when you understand that it creates inflammation, and then you understand that chronic inflammation is the basis of disease and you're not resolving it, this could give you an ability to access, by working with this, you could access people with chronic stress, psychological stress. It could help you shift it because you shift the stress in their system, if you know what I mean. So other things, vigorous physical activity, especially like things like running marathons or something, leaky gut, obesity. People who are obese, they cannot go into the resolution phase. And then it's also connected to the type 2 diabetes, insulin resistance, and all these kind of things. So, you know, so if you've got clients that are obese, that's something you should really think about, is looking at their inflammation. And, you know, if you want to be really sure, you could work with someone who like a naturopath or a doctor who does integrated medicine or something. Someone who can actually test for the different markers for this, you know, because these things, and there are other things that trigger it as well. These are just some ideas of what the triggers should be, and only the first two are the ones that actually should be there. That is microbe or injury. The rest should not be there. They should not be part of our life, but they are. Okay, then we've got the pro-inflammatory phase, and, you know, as it says there, it should be an acute response, but often it's not. You get edema, which is swelling. Pain is often a big part of it. The neutrophils come in and activate the macrophages, and I'll just mention that next. Then you've got the so-called M1 macrophages, which are the ones that release the pro-inflammatory cytokines, which a cytokine is a hormone. And these are the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and chemokines for that matter, bring in, you know, they create the, you know, you get pain, you create the swelling, when you open the capillaries, the immune cells come in because you've got injury or microbial attack. You have to, you want all these cells to come in and clean everything up for you. That's what it's supposed to be. Supposed to be acute. And then once they're done, it all shuts down. Then you get the resolution phase where the macrophages then in the M1, M2 macrophage model, they switch from M1 to M2 and they start releasing the pro-resolving mediators and the pro-resolving cytokines as well. It's not just the mediators, there are cytokines as well that are considered pro-resolution of inflammation. So neutrophils, as we look back here in this picture, you can see that PMN is the neutrophils. They're the first guys. They're the guys that go straight in there. Like, we got a problem, you know, they're like your guys that they're your problem-solving team. Okay, we've got a problem here. Let's sort this out. So they're in there. They're the first on the site, whether it's a microbe or it's an injury. And they activate macrophages into the M1 state through the interleukin 12, which is a cytokine. They release cytokines and chemokines and express toll-like receptors. And the toll-like receptors are kind of interesting thing that I've been woken up to, and I hope when we have the conference later in the year with Stephen Hansen, some of you may have seen the interview I did with Stephen around the coronavirus. It's on our YouTube channel, and he's been practicing MK for, I don't know, around 18 years and been a kinesiologist for, I don't know, 25 years or something, or even longer. And he's used the NK system and modified it and adapted it in an autoimmune clinic that he works in. And he started talking about these toll-like receptors, and I never understood. I thought, oh, I've sort of heard of them, but what do they do? And the more and more I keep learning about all these immune things, the more and more I think, oh, he was really onto something there. And when we run the free conference, you know, his talk will be very interesting for, especially if people are interested in autoimmune and immune issues. He knows a lot about that, and he works in an autoimmune clinic with a medical doctor. So he does kinesiology, and then they test the blood. So he knows what actually changes the blood and things, and how long it takes to clear something, and all this kind of thing. So these are the neutrophils, and they're important to understand that they're the first guys onto the site of inflammation, and they're supposed to be the first step in the line of defense that is quick, acute, and then should go away. Okay. The problem is when things don't go away. So when I was looking at the macrophages, this is what I came up with, and because I was kind of shocked because I'd been led to believe about all these, you know, M1 and M2 macrophages, and so I thought, listening to the people, I'd been to these, you know, conferences, I thought, oh, that's it. But, you know, then I found this paper, and they had these, they had a different way of looking at it, and I was like, oh. So they've got the monocyte-derived macrophages. So they're derived from your bone marrow throughout your life. And so the monocytes will float around your blood, float, float, float. And when there's inflammation and they're like, oh, we're going to go, there's inflammation, they will go to the site of inflammation and then transform into macrophages. Okay. And so they're from the bone marrow. Then you've got the tissue resident macrophages, or the TRMs. I'm like, oh, what's that? And they come from the yolk sac or the fetal liver. And I'm like, seriously? Do you mean we form these things in our fetal life. They've gone all over our body, and they persist in many tissues via self-renewal, so they proliferate. Oh, that's kind of different to what I heard. And then they talked about, I thought, well, maybe they mean the same thing. They said, oh, there's the M1, M2 box, they called it. A lot of people have this paradigm of M1 and M2. But the problem with, the thing about this, the M1 and M2, is that the studies were done in vitro, which means as in like a test tube or a petri dish or something like this, not in vivo, which is the, you know, when you're actually looking at something that's happening in a living being. And so the administration of LPS, which is the lipopolysaccharides, they're inflammatory producing, and interferon gamma gives you the M1 macrophages, which produce the pro-inflammatory cytokines, tumor necrosis factor alpha and interleukin-6. And then if you administer interleukin-4 and interleukin-13, you get the M2, or the anti-inflammatory cytokines. So that was kind of interesting for me. And and then what I understand is when I show you this, it doesn't matter which paradigm you're talking about macrophages, because the effect is the same. The effect is the same. Okay, and so this is what they showed about the MOMs and the TRMs. So the MOMs are the, so when you've got homeostasis, so this is in your tissue, you've got here your tissue residing macrophages, they sort of sit there, they self-proliferate. Then what happens is when you've got tissue injury or microbial attack or some of the other triggers of inflammation, you can see the monocytes, which are normally floating in the blood, they come to the site, convert to these monocyte-derived macrophages. And then you've got the, so they're the ones that more produce the, they produce more the pro-inflammatory cytokines, and then the monocyte-derived macrophages are much more active in the pro-inflammatory phase than the tissue tissue-resident macrophages. Then once inflammation is over, you've got the resolution, and you can see here these TRMs, the ones that were back here, they start becoming active, and these ones either die, and some of these die, or these ones transform and they actually become like the actual, like these ones. And so they have, when they say phenotype, it means that the actual, you know, because when you look at different types of, say, and this is the same for any type of cell, whether it's a T cell, a B cell, or a macrophage, when you've got the different types, which they call phenotypes here, which just means type, they express different molecules on their membrane. That's how they can tell which one it is. So when they look at a T helper cell or a T killer cell, they look at the different molecules on the membrane and they can tell which one it is. And so what happens is these ones actually transform into those. And so then they become this. So technically, if we're looking at the M1 and M2 phenotype, the monocyte-derived macrophages are the M1s and the tissue-residing macrophages are the M2s. If that makes any sense. So what's the big deal about this? You know, we should just do, why don't we just do this and then that, the green line? Well, as you know, as some very wise sage once said, shit happens. This just happens sometimes for various reasons, and I'm not certainly going into that. But if you look at the macrophage secretions and tissue repair, so this is what happens when macrophages go into the pro-resolving phase. We get anti-inflammatory cytokines, matrix metal proteinases, they're enzymes, osteopontin's a hormone. Again, like these, it's a protein hormone. And then you get these specialized pro-resolving mediators, which are the so-called resolvins, protectins, maresins, and lipoxins. And this is where I want to focus the talk from here, is talking about these guys, because there have been shown a lot of studies on it, and especially, say, Metagenics, they have a product for it called SPM. They're looking at the actual pro-resolving mediators. Of course, I want to show you how you can balance these pathways. So the idea of a kinesiology balance for this would be, okay, there's inflammation somewhere, say in the lungs or something. A lot of people have got lung issues at the moment, or maybe I'm just projecting my own issues onto the world, who knows. And, you know, like how can we balance this for the, how can we balance this for, you know, to help the resolution of inflammation? So looking at these hormones, because that's what they are, they're hormones. They're derived from 4 distinct fatty acids that I can find. And you can see, I've got this chart, I've sort of modified it out of my Nutrition A manual, and yeah, arachidonic acid's kind of well known. It's omega-6. It's got 20 carbons and 4 double bonds. That's what this means. Then you've got DHA, or docosahexaenoic acid. It's omega-3 with 22 carbons and 6. Docosapentanoic acid has got 3, again 22 and 5. And eicosapentanoic acid, or EPA, it's the, you know, what you get from fish oil, for example, has got 3, 20 and 5. So the most well-known ones are DHA and the EPA, and the DPA is not so well known, and AA is what known. I mean, but that only produces 2, mostly anti-inflammatory. So let's look at a little bit of fatty acid biochemistry, I guess. So this is what a fatty acid looks like. I mean, it's not really a proper one, but you know, you've got over here, this structure here is the carboxylic acid. You've got here, they call it the delta N. So you might get an enzyme called delta 6 desaturase. So basically 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. At the 6th carbon, it will desaturate this and put a double bond in, for example. Or you might get a delta 5 desaturase. It's just telling you where it puts the double bond in, because the saturated fatty acid has no double bonds. Omega, this is the omega end, and you can see I've coloured these carbons. This is the 3rd carbon from the omega end, the 6th carbon, and the 9th. So if the first double bond is here, it's on the 3rd carbon, so that would be omega-3. This one, it's on the 6th carbon, so it's omega-6. And if it was over here on the 9th carbon, it would be omega-9. That's what they mean by the omega-3, 6, and 9. Okay. Unsaturated fats. So a saturated fat means there's no double bonds in the carbon chain. You can see, I'm not going into carbon biochemistry, but every carbon wants to have 4 bonds because that fills its outer electron shell. So here you've got a double bond, and you can see that these hydrogens, what happens when you get a double bond, it puts a bend in the fatty acid. And anyone knows me and my rule number 1, I won't ask anyone because some of you might know rule number 1 from biochemistry is structure governs function. And you can see here by putting a bend in the fatty acid, it completely changes its shape and really is important for its function. This is a saturated fat, and you can see it's very flat. And if you get a lot of saturated fats in, say, your cell membranes, your membranes become really rigid. If you've got unsaturated fats in your cell membranes, because they've got these bends, it spaces out the fatty acids, and it makes the membranes very fluid. And they know in neurons, for example, DHA is very important to have in the membranes of your neurons and stuff like that. Otherwise, they don't work properly. So, you know, omega-3 fatty acids are quite important. Then you've got the cis-trans fatty acid discussion. So I'm not sure if everyone actually knows what the difference is, but basically that's it. When I showed you this, that's a cis fatty acid because the hydrogens are on the same side. You can see this is where you've got a double bond because each carbon wants to have 4 bonds. When you've got 2 with the carbon and 1 with the next carbon, that means there can only be 1 hydrogen, which is like a plug. But here where there's a single bond, you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, you get 2 hydrogens like this, and it makes it like a very flat shape. So when you've got the cis-trans, what happens is when you've got a cis fatty acid, they're on the same side, and that puts a bend in the fatty acid. But when they're on the opposite, like this is a trans fatty acid. Because they're on the opposite side, that's what trans actually means. It makes it flat. And you can see here a trans fatty acid, essentially, I mean, it's the worst fat you can have because it does the same function as a saturated fat, very flat, but it makes your membranes really rigid. But also because the double bonds are more susceptible to reactive oxygen attack. And so when you've got reactive oxygen attack, that's what damages the cell membranes and causes aging and stuff like that. So you're still susceptible to the aging effects of reactive oxygen, but you've got the effect of a saturated fat. You'd be better off with a saturated fat because at least then you're not going to have your membranes damaged. You know, that's what it kind of looks like. And these are the SPMs, or the specialized pro-resolving mediators. And so you can see the first 2, lipoxin A and lipoxin B, they're derived from arachidonic acid. And there's only 2 because arachidonic acid was omega-6. And it's kind of interesting because most hormones derived from arachidonic acid are actually pro-inflammatory. So people say, oh yeah, omega-6, arachidonic acid, pro-inflammatory, you know, you get a lot of it in red meat, etc. Or, you know, like things like non-fish seafood have a lot of omega-6. And so that's one of the issues. And with the omega-3, you can see you've got the DHA here. All these are derived from DHA from here, the merisins and protectin and resolvins. Then you've got these other ones, DPA. These are the more hidden ones. You don't actually see them really in a lot of places. I never knew about them until I actually started researching it. And I came across them and I thought, oh, no one ever told me about that. But here we are. So that's DPA. And then you've got 3 from EPA here, resolvent E1, E2, and E3. So they're the known ones that I could find. And I don't go on what other people say, even, you know, when I go to these fancy seminars with all these big hot gun presenters from the United States or whatever. I don't believe a word of it. I have to understand it, and I look into it myself, and I come out with what I understand, and this is what I understand. So what is actually became important are the enzymes. And so some important enzymes in SPM production, COX-2. I wonder if any of you ever heard of the COX-2 inhibitors and the COX inhibitors. There are a lot of the things like paracetamol, ibuprofen. They inhibit the COX enzyme. You've got COX-1 and 2. And the problem with them is, okay, they relieve the symptoms of inflammation, which is usually pain. But what happens with them when you do that is that you also inhibit the resolution of inflammation. And then you've got these other ones, lipoxygenase, and basically they're putting OH group on the fatty acid. So you've got, again, 3 of those, the 5, 12, and 15 lipoxygenase. And I've put their EC numbers in there for those of you who have done NK. Know that all you have to do is look up your enzyme format database and you can get a format for those. So I like to put EC numbers in there, even if some people don't. So just having a look at a few of the pathways. And so this is EPA with your resolvin 1, 2. And you can see here EPA, and you can see here you got these hydroxy groups put on there. And you got here, this is 5 lipoxygenase, peroxidase, which is another enzyme. That's actually a difficult one. And so you can see these are the EPA pathways. Kind of interesting. And I just wanted to show you that because you can see the differences. You know, basically here you've got your fatty acid, and then there you're just sticking on the, and you can see here you've got your 5 double bonds, and here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And so you get these different ones put in. This is DHA. I could not find a diagram for DPA. It's just very unknown. So you can see here you've got the 15 locks, the 5, and these are some of the resolvins from DHA. And you can see again, you just, all these hydroxy groups being put on, and you've got this different steps, enzymatic steps that take place. One of the biggest problems with these is the first enzymatic step doesn't work so well. What happens is the enzymes they prefer omega-6 fatty acids, and because the same enzymes work on omega-6, omega-3, and they produce hormones, but the omega-6 will be more pro-inflammatory rather than the omega-3. And it's the omega-3 that we need that are going to help with the resolution of inflammation. Another picture you can see here. This one's the 15, the 5, and the 12 lipoxygenase. You can see this is kind of cool. COX-2, cytochrome P450s. Some of you might know that from the pyrrole work. They're all those pyrrole enzymes. And again, this is showing you the different pathways to get your different enzymes, but all the different pro-resolving mediators, basically. So this is the way it is. And just wanted to show you something about omega-3 and omega-6, because we've got the here. Sometimes they put omega as N, and alpha-linolenic acid and linoleic acid. They're what are called the essential fatty acids. I know Richard Utt used to call them vitamin F. And you can see you've got, these are the enzymes, they have the same pathway. And here you get to arachidonic acid and EPA, and then you've got all your different enzymes that are produced here. And you can see arachidonic acid produces all like heaps of different prostaglandins, leukotrienes, thromboxanes, you know, as well as lipoxin. I mean, lipoxin, anyone who's done my hormone course will know, lipoxin's a little square over there and the rest are like this massive thing. So these are the pathways of the omega-3 and 6 fatty acids. So now let's look at some kinesiology, just some important modes. I mean, probably you all know this: nutrition mode, hormone mode, and this point here, important, stomach 11 on the right. This was a point from Richard Utt. I mean, he didn't put it as an acupoint, I converted it to one, but he had it there, stomach. He used to call it vitamin F because it was for the essential fatty acids. But when I realized it was for all fatty acids. So enzyme mode. And so what I did is I put some formats there because we need the enzyme mode for the enzymes. We need the hormone mode and for, you know, to access hormones, and also nutrition, and stomach 11 on the right can give us fatty acids. But if we use, I'll just get, where are we? Okay. So if we use nutrition, hormone, and stomach 11 on the right together, what we can do is we can just say, well, that's a fatty acid hormone, basically, because nutrition, stomach 11 on the right is, right. This right? My right? So nutrition times stomach 11 on the right is actually what we'd use for fatty acids. So if I add hormone mode, you know, so I hold nutrition, stomach 11 on the right, and hormone together, what we're doing is we're saying, well, we've got a hormone from fatty acids. And so then what we're doing is, when we're looking at those, if you look at the last slide of the PowerPoint that I put there, you've got these 4 formats. Let's see what goes into those. Oops. Okay. So if you look at these formats, so just want to explain them to you for a little bit. So these ones here are immune. And then you've got lung light touch for inflammation, neutrophils is small intestine light touch, monocytes is heart light touch, macrophages is pericardium light touch. These 4 formats are from my immune 1 course, but they're important in the inflammation. So how can we use those in our work? And so what we can do is, and so this is an idea, and I'll just do it as a kind of a self-balancing idea, is that if I'm like, you know, say if I want, like myself, I reckon maybe lung issues, you know. Yeah, I was in Ecuador and I was in the United States and I was in Europe, like Spain, Germany, Austria during this coronavirus, you know, when it first started from early to mid-March, I was in all these countries. And so, you know, lung, also grief, you know, had some death in the family. So that would be good. So I would want to like activate my lungs if I wanted to work on myself. And so you could do that by putting the lung format for lung is anatomy and gland and lung format. It's going to pause lock it. You can't see it there, but I'm pause locking. And then I can activate my deltoids. I like to activate deltoids by just moving them, activating them, doing the movement. Okay. And then I'm just going to muscle test myself. A bit of stress. I'm just going to put some energy into my lung chakras. Okay, so so I've got my lungs in, so we can try this format. So, you know, nutrition physiology, spleen 20 times governing 20. Spleen 20 on both sides. And then we could do the lung alarm point light touch for inflammation. So I've put the lungs in. So this is the inflammation in the lungs, and I'll de-stress it by de-stressing my lung chakras. Then again, neutrophils, small intestine light touch. It's down the bottom there. So, yeah. I've since figured that balancing myself is actually really good for me. And then monocytes. And then the macrophage format. And so you can do those formats. And then I want to do nutrition, hormone, and stomach 11 on the right. Okay. So I'm just I'm just balancing what's in these important, these formats that I put on your last slide. And I'm doing it to my lungs because that's what I need personally. Okay, so the idea, yeah, I can see your messages, Evelyn. Anyway, so the idea is that when you're oh, maybe I'll just go back to sharing the screen. And the idea is that you you do these formats in a specific location, acupressure formats, such as, for me, I was doing the lungs. And then at the last point, I did I combined this mode, and this point as a way of accessing the hormones derived from fatty acids, basically. So, I mean, obviously I have far more complex formatting for that, and I'm not going to be talking about that here in the in this space, because that would require a whole thing. Okay, so I'm getting some questions in physiology mode. I didn't use physiology mode, but that's it. So I can see the question there, people asking what physiology mode is. Oh yeah, I did. Sorry, it was in the format. That's physiology, that's nutrition. Physiology. So, and I don't know, these are Richard's modes: anatomy, time, physiology. Pathology was added later, and it's ATP, anatomy, time, physiology. Sort of, it's the way you do it. Okay. Any other questions? Type them in. All right, well, I don't know. I hope that's helpful. And I hope you all have learned something from it. We tried to automate the marketing, the emails this time. I hope, well, everyone here must have got it. Pathology. Pathology, so anatomy, time, physiology, pathology. It's on the little finger. I was balancing the lung chakras here. The lung chakras are to do with grief. I don't know. It's something I investigated myself, so I've never seen it in anyone else's work unless they copied it off me. I don't know. It's something I sort of looked at. I think it was back in 2004 or five. I had it in there. Okay, so I'm going to stop recording and then I'm going to start answering your questions, okay?